Well, we'd like to start also with a question we ask a lot of people, uh, highly revealing. So, if you had to pick a dead scientist to bring back and
Oh,
sit down, have a beer with, and chat about, the modern state of science, who would it be, and what would you talk about?
yeah. There's so many like the obvious one, Einstein and uh, you know, Feynman and all these guys. They'd be fun. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to go with somebody who nobody else is going to pick, and that'd be Lavoisier.
Ah,
Ah, okay.
excellent.
So both because I learned in doing the research for this book how important he was in figuring out what metabolism, what respiration was all about, and so he did a lot of really early big work, just sort of the foundational stuff that you don't even think about anybody having to figure out. Like what is oxygen and how does it work? Like the basic stuff like that. He didn't discover oxygen, but anyway, he had his head chopped off in the
I was wondering if you're going to
he
mention
got
that part.
yeah, he got
That's
guillotined, man. And so,
congratulations.
I think being a scientist in this day and age, maybe it's always been political. There's always been politics and science have been interwoven, but um, he, in a scene that must have been something like we all saw on TV 2 weeks ago, people were at the gate, and came in and it didn't work out for him. They cut his head off. So, what would it be like? What was his take on it, and on the whole politics and science interaction, and how that all worked back then, and how different is it now? How much is the same? And also, I think he would just be super fun because, man, we've learned so much about the stuff he was excited about, in 200 years. So that would be a fun
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah,
So
yeah.
Lavoisier, I don't speak French. So in this imagination game, I have to also learn French along the way. But that's
That's all right. Minor stuff. Dead scientists, 300 years in the
exactly,
future. Really go.
yeah,
So
Yeah,
what do you think he would be? What do you think he would think about the obesity epidemic in the States
yeah. I,
and in
so
France.
the
and in
obesity
France?
epidemic, industrialization started in Europe, around that got started to get going. People were starting to get overweight. You started to see it, and of course, it wasn't seen as like a bad thing necessarily.
Hmm.
If you had a few extra pounds, that was kind of a sign of privilege.
That's a very good point. Yeah, those.
And so I'm not sure, but so I think the inklings of it were there. Is it Darwin's grandfather Erasmus, his father, or his grandfather Erasmus? I think it was his grandfather, who actually had to have his kitchen table carved out, like where he would sit, so he could like put himself up to the table. And he had it. This is famous. He had it famously carved out, so he could actually put himself up on the table and eat because he was so big. And it wasn't seen as like a bad thing. Um, so I don't know. I think he might wonder why we're worried about it,
Hmm.
um, and I think that you still had enough infectious disease then. The big killers were not heart disease yet. It wasn't
Right.
diabetes. It wasn't, so having a few extra pounds to survive when you were, you had pneumonia for 3 months and just were no antibiotics to get you through.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
Pretty
don't know.
important.
There's not really a big downside there.
Yeah.
So I wonder what he'd think. I think he'd be amazed that we were so healthy in all these other ways that it mattered that you were a little bit overweight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
It'd be awesome to take Lavoisier into the lab and show him, a modern flow through respirometer with,
Oh man, yeah.
16 channel air switching device. And
I know it. I know it. In the before times, the last trip my family took, I've got an 8 and a 6-year-old, and last summer, 2 summers ago now, we did our first big international trip, and we flew to Paris. And we have we have some family there, so we were there to visit family, but also to see Paris. And there's the museum of it's a museum of invention. I forget what it's got a French name, surprisingly enough, and I don't remember what that is, but it's a museum of invention, and they have Lavoisier's lab.
huh.
I couldn't believe it, and they have a little tank that he had built, this sort of double-walled tank where he put the guinea pig. You know
Mhm.
about this? He put
Yeah.
the big guinea pig and he had it melt the ice, and he measured how much water melted, and that's how he figured out how much
Yeah,
heat
it's
happened.
so brilliant.
That would be
I
so
still
cool.
teach about that in my comparative animal
Yeah.
physiology class,
It's so
just because it's
great.
such a clever idea.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Huh.
Anyway, and I was explaining this to my kids, and they're like, "So the guinea pig went in there?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they're like, "That's not nice for the guinea pig." And I'm like, "Well,
no.
good point, but sorry."
Huh. Hey, do you know that
Yeah.
was there mentioned in that exhibit that was the original guinea pig? You hear in science that the study thing is the guinea
Ah,
pig. I've always wondered where that came from. Can we credit Lavoisier with?
he would have been yeah, good question. Why
It's so
was he
ironic
the
now that we talk
first?
about guinea pigs and we only study mice and fruit flies. So I just
No, I
there's got to be
know.
some history for that guinea pig.
Oh, now that's a good one. I got to track that down. I don't know.
Okay,
I don't know the
good.
answer to that.
That'll be. We can write that paper together. We'll figure out
Mm,
the history and where the
that'd be
guinea
fun.
pig concept came from.
Yeah.
So one other really quick one. Tell us about a non-science hobby.
I have during COVID, I have gotten really into woodworking.
Mm,
And so I grew up in a pretty kind of DIY rural part of Pennsylvania. So, like everybody worked on their own house and worked on their own cars. And that's what was the culture. And so my dad had a workshop and he loved to do woodworking and stuff like that. And so, I kind of developed those skills as a kid a bit, but then, man, I spent grad school. You don't have any, I lived in an apartment, and then my first job at WashU, I had a little wood shop, and then 7 years in New York, and nobody has a wood shop in New York. That's insane. And so I had been away from it for so long, but then over COVID, I moved it here to Duke in 2018. We have a house where I can actually have some tools in a closet somewhere, and it's just been so fun to get back to it and to spend a day. I just built a dining room table that I need to finish, need to put the polish on, and I built a patio, and I built a little crossbow for my kid. Just little stuff like that. That's just super fun. And when you're done with it, you can look at it, and
yeah.
it's the same feeling you get from finishing a great paper, and you get the proofs, and you're like, yes, we
Right.
did it.
Right.
But no, that's been really fun, and just a completely different way to use my brain. Yeah, it's been the one. If there's a good thing, and I'm not sure there is, with this whole COVID fiasco, it's for us personally, it's been that.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Awesome.
How about you guys? You guys been busy over the have you have you been able to explore anything interesting with the COVID lockdown, or has it been? I hope it hasn't been all bad. Maybe it has.
No.
I got to explore a small town in Australia in which I was trapped on sabbatical when Australia went into the lockdown in March, and I was there for a
Okay.
couple more months. But actually, it was great in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I don't mind the kind of small town life, and being forced to do it. It's like, well, you can't travel, you can't do anything, which was a drag. We had a lot of big trips planned, but it was
Yeah.
nice to get to know that local area.
Yeah. That's
So,
cool.
yeah.
Totally by accident, Art and I did our sabbaticals in practically
Basically
the same
town.
town.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So I spent a lot of time there a couple years earlier. Yeah.
Yeah.
My baking prowess has improved a little bit during
Okay.
COVID, so that's a bit of a positive. But my family's a little bit tired from bagels and breads and all of the other
Yeah.
things. They have a
Right.
very different take on carbs than we're going to get to later today. So
Yeah. Right.
so that's
right.
been challenging with my wife. Stop doing that. Stop making all that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, Herman, it's a thrill to have you on the show, and let's turn to the conversation about your book, which is going to come out soon, possibly just before this podcast episode is published. It's called "Burn: The New Science of Human Metabolism." It covers a lot of familiar territory for me and Marty, but also a lot of things we didn't know, and just super fascinating look at the way humans and other primates handle energy, the evolutionary trajectories by which we got to where we are, a lot of the really interesting kind of underlying physiology and sensory systems that integrate how we deal with energy. I want to get into it by having you tell us just a little bit about your experiences in Africa with the Hadza people. So you spent a really significant amount of time in north central Tanzania, living with them, studying them, working with them, and trying to understand the way a hunter-gatherer society deals with energy and integrates this stuff in their environment. So maybe tell us about the Hadza and what you did and what you've started to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my training is in evolutionary anthropology or biological anthropology. So basically basic science, the basic science of human biology, not applied, not clinical kind of human physiology and biology from an evolutionary point of view. And, energy is always a big piece of that, right? How does the body bring in calories? How does it spend it on maintenance and reproduction and growth, right? The big three, and also movement and range and ecology and that kind of stuff. So that's always have always been my interests in my career. And I was interested. I spent my graduate work looking at locomotor energetics. So trying to figure out, I made a mathematical model for how leg length and muscle anatomy relates to how many calories you burn to walk and run, and how you can apply it to different animals. And then the idea was I was going to take that sort of small piece about locomotor energetics, and I was going to understand it in the context of the total human energy budget, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to do that, or for any ape actually, to kind of do it comparatively and evolutionarily, to understand how ours have changed, because our locomotion has changed a lot, where we walk on 2 legs instead of 4.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole set of questions there. And they all have to do, a lot of them revolve around energy and energy efficiency and energy budgets. And as I kind of began framing that work and thinking about it with my close collaborators, Dave Reichland, who's now at USC, and Brian Wood, who's now at UCLA, I thought, gosh, what we want to understand is, again, the sort of the whole energy budget of humans, right? And we want to understand it. I looked in the literature, and there's no data on humans as hunter-gatherers. There's data on humans like you and me, right? And that's interesting, but not really super useful, because humans are hunting and gathering.
Burn to sit at a desk typing at your computer,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. So we're a hunting and gathering species. We've been hunting and gathering for 2.5 million years, and that's how our bodies were shaped. And so we want to have, if we want to understand anything about our physiology, I would argue, then the normal baseline is to understand that in a hunting and gathering society. That's and there's a million ways to be a hunter-gatherer, but even one idea of what that looks like would be better than 0, which is what we often have. And so it happened that I had a good contact with Frank Marlowe, who's now since passed away, and his student Brian Wood, who's basically the same graduate school cohort as me at Harvard. We're still good friends, and we figured out we could go and do this work with the Hadza. So we could go and measure energy expenditures there with the Hadza. The Hadza are a population of hunter-gatherers. About 1,000 of them, fewer than that, are still actively hunting and gathering in northern Tanzania. And so it was just purely, let's go and see. It was exploration, discovery science. We had the idea that they would be burning lots more calories than we do, because they're so much more physically active. And like everybody else, I knew it would be the case, that they would burn hundreds more calories every day than we do. And then we went out there and measured it. Yeah.
So tell us something more. I mean, get some specifics. How active are they? And I think, in the book, you talk a lot about just how much they walk. That's one of the emphases, them versus the westernized sort of thing. So how much is a typical walking day?
We just had Brian just led a paper on this, looking at men and women's movement. And he put it in the context of steps per day, which was useful, because everybody's counting their steps.
Oh yeah, we got the watches.
Exactly. So a Hadza woman, with a kid on her back, gets about 12,000 steps a day. A Hadza man gets about 18,000 steps a day. And that's up and down hills, and that's in addition to climbing trees to get honey if you're a man, and it's in addition to digging wild tubers out of the ground with a stick if you're a woman. So they get, the sort of rule of thumb is they get about as much activity in a day as Americans get in a week or more.
Wow.
So incredibly physically active.
Pretty religious tracker of my steps with my own Fitbit. So did you get the Hadza to wear Fitbits to get these step
not
data?
Fitbits, but essentially
something
that kind of device, an accelerometer. Yeah. And so there's different versions of that, and the research grade ones give you more data than the Fitbits do. So we it's all research grade stuff, so we can get steps out of it, or we can get magnitude of movement, or we can get timing over the course of the day. So yeah, but it's basically a Fitbit.
Got it.
Right.
So this must cost significant energy to walk that much, right? So
sure, and we measured that too. So we actually we set up a track around camp with them, and we brought out a briefcase respirometry system called a Cosmed makes these things, and we measured walking costs, and it's the same as you and me. So their walking efficiency is not any different. And so, walking that many steps and at the same cost, the same gas mileage, they should be burning tons of calories every day.
Is that surprising that they're not more efficient than us? I mean, if they spend that much time walking,
Yeah,
and
so
or is just
there's a
walking
big
is
debate
walking no
about
matter who you
this.
are and where you are?
Yeah, when people have, so if it's an activity that you're not used to, then you get better as you train.
Mhm.
Um, and so, but everybody can walk. Everybody's used to walking, so that's not too big of a surprise. People have done training experiments. This is a whole separate world of sports science. But if you get people training to run over the, like you get them on a running program, and you see if they run more efficiently at baseline versus 3 months from now, you get minor changes sometimes, sort of all over the map, the data, but the results, but maybe something like 2 to 4% increase in running economy, cost per kilometer per kilogram.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I'm actually not surprised that it's the same, but everybody expects them to be more,
Yeah.
anyway, so I'm not too shocked.
They should just be better at this, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Does that transfer to other modalities? I thought one of the cool portions of your book is that you were juxtaposing the cost of walking versus the cost of running versus climbing.
Yeah.
Does the same thing transfer, that you sort of no matter how much you train, you really can't gain any more than a few percentage efficiency?
Yeah, it's again, I think if it's something that you're not used to,
Right.
then there's like a training aspect, there's like a mechanics aspect of it, But
Hmm.
once you kind of get comfortable with the mechanics of something, you can't change. So, for example, we measured their climbing costs too on a separate trip. So they climb these baobab trees. They go 10 meters up to get honey, and that's an interesting question about how much that costs them. There's also a really dangerous thing to do. So the cost is
Costly of
probably
another
more.
form, yeah.
Yeah, the cost is more the morbidity cost probably, but so we measured that, and it's the same as we measured rock climbers here back in the States, and it's the same, and it's actually the same. Everything has the same efficiency climbing. So squirrels running up and down trees, and monkeys at the zoo or in the forest, and humans at the rock climbing gym or climbing baobab trees. Everybody's about 20% efficient. So because climbing is an activity where you can actually measure the work being done, like textbook physics. Like, oh, I took a mass
Right.
and I
You lift
raised
a
it up
weight.
this high,
Yeah.
so
Right.
that's work. And you can ask, if you did that much work, how many calories did you burn? And everything is 15 to 20% efficient.
Got it.
Everything.
Got it.
Hmm.
So when you visit them, you presumably are also walking a lot with them. So
Yeah.
are you out there walking 15 or 20,000 steps a day? And
Sure. Yeah.
and what's
Yeah.
that like? I mean, is it a shock
They're
to the
long
Western life?
days. Those are
Yeah.
long days. Yeah. And you bring some water and some snacks, and you kind of go for it. Brian Wood, like I said, he spent a large part of his life, his adult life, out there with them. So he's got some really epic stories of days that just kept on going and kept on going, and really wiped him out. But as it happens, Brian keeps himself in good shape, and so do I, and so does Dave Reichland, and so
not a total shock.
not a total shock, and
Yeah.
you've got to what you're signing up for. But the thing is, it is hot. It's really, you're on the equator. There's very little shade, and so that's the big thing. It isn't like the mileage; it's the fact that when I first get there, it takes me a week to just feel like I'm not, a dried out sponge at the end of the day, every day.
Yeah. Got it.
Yeah.
Go for it, Marty.
Oh yeah. So let's do a little bit on the supply side of things, and I think we're going to talk a bunch later, so we don't have to steal too much thunder right now getting into paleo diets and such. But what do they eat? And I my favorite stat that you gave is that the Hadza, something like 8 to 10% of their diet, the calories come from honey. This is
Even
wonderful.
more than that sometimes. Yeah, that's right.
That's amazing.
Right. Yeah, and we've done the analysis, and the honey they eat is the same honey as you're going to buy in the store. It's just in terms of like macronutrients, just sugar and water, man. In fact, it's about the same mix of fructose, for example, and glucose as high fructose corn syrup. And so, there's all this demonization of sugar here in the West. And by the way, I don't think you should add sugar to your diet any more than, I'm not saying you should go out and eat sugar. But they eat a huge amount of honey, which is just sugar. And they eat a lot of tubers, which are these starchy vegetables, just raw root vegetables. About half their diet, calories wise, is meat. That kind of goes up and down over the course of a year or even year to year. The rest of it's all plants and honey. Yeah, so it's a real mix, and the whole idea that there is a paleo diet, that there's sort of one thing that hunter-gatherers do is ridiculous, because you go, again, any season you go, any year you go, it might be different, than the last time. And then the other thing is like the idea that they don't eat carbs is just laughable. But anyway,
it's not possible, I know, to say that they are representative, but I could see, skeptics saying, well, this, maybe they're an outlier. This honey thing, that alone doesn't sound typical. There's plenty of parts of the world where hunting and gathering of honey wouldn't even be an option. But to what extent do you think that they are representative of, if it's fair to even think about the average hunter-gathering diet? I mean, are they the outliers, or is it more typical?
No, they're pretty typical. They're pretty typical for tropical and temperate, for warm climate, which is where we're all from, by the way. People like to use I love the paleo diet arguments. It's just like, well, if you look at what the people in the Arctic are doing, like, well, Arctic lifestyles are about 8,000 years old. They're actually less old than farming. And my guess is they're not, the argument, right, has to be that our genes were shaped by these environments. And if you aren't a descendant of somebody from that environment, your genes can't be shaped by it, right? So there's like and also sort of an identity issue there. Anyway, that's a whole separate question. But no, they're pretty typical. And, we have data, there are ethnographic data for a couple hundred hunter-gatherer groups. Almost all of them, other than a handful, are now, those cultures don't exist as hunter-gatherer cultures anymore. They're on reservations, or they're just assimilated into villages or whatever. And that's another tragedy. But there's diversity. There's a huge amount of diversity. Some groups did eat a lot of meat. Some groups ate almost all plants, and so, but it kind of settles out at around 50-50-ish plants and animal calories. And that's where the odds are. So, I think they're pretty typical, actually. Now, it's hard to know. Like then the argument is, well, okay, but what about 1,000 years ago? Or what about 100,000 years ago? Right? Because the environments have changed, and that's true. That's absolutely true. But the farther you go back into the archaeological record, right, the inferences you're drawing from what you're finding in the archaeological record get farther and farther away from the detail that you can watch by actually watching somebody.
You might as well use the data you have today.
And not only that, but people use how many, they look at an archaeological site, they dig up the bones, the cut marked bones, whatever, and those archaeologists are saying, well, this looks like, a North American, a Native American hunting site. And so we draw these inferences based on what we know about the ethnography. There's always an ethnographic implication there, even when it's purely an analysis of the archaeological record. And then people say, well, if you go to the archaeological record, we can ignore the ethnography, we can ignore the living population and just look at the archaeology. But actually you can't, because all the interpretation of the archaeology to begin with is based on the ethnography. So it's it's this weird, people really chasing their tails to and on one level, you guys know, there's a lot of scientific debate that is just always going to be unresolved, and maybe unresolvable depending on the question, right? These are philosophical kind of how you want to view the data kind of questions, right? There's that class of arguments, and then there's a class of arguments that I know the conclusion I want to get to, and I'm going to cherry pick the data to get there. And they can sound like very similar arguments, right? Like, well, I view the data this way, and there's like, okay, that's a fair way to view the data. And there's well, I'm only going to look at these studies, or I'm going to take this kind of extreme view of things because I want to tell you at the end of the day that you should be eating a ketogenic diet or something. And so it pains me as an anthropologist and somebody who really thinks it's interesting to wonder where we're from and what our past is like, and to see it kind of used that way, it's frustrating.
Right.
I get it.
In modern times, we do have, maybe just say a little bit about this. There's a bunch of neat genetic examples that sort of, it's leveraging our more modern tools to be able to say something about historical diet. So you want to say something about copies of amylase genes, and, lactase persistence is one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's
this is kind of about evolutionary trajectories over just the last 8 or 10 or 12,000 years, right? I mean,
So, humans have more so salivary amylase is an enzyme that breaks down starch. It's in your spit, which is why it's salivary amylase. And animals that eat a lot of starch tend to have more copies of it. So it's a copy number based gene. You make more of the enzyme if you have more of the copies. And so when you look across species or even across people, individuals, you'll see some have more copies and some have less. And that relates, we think, to how much actual amylase you make. And humans have more salivary amylase copies than chimps do, for example. So, and they eat like an almost entirely plant-based diet, including lots of sugary and even starchy foods. Well, probably less starchy, actually. That's kind of the key point here. But we have been apparently under selection to produce more of this enzyme to deal with more starch, right? So, okay, that's one clue that eating starch is actually kind of normal for humans. There's the lactase persistent gene is a great one too, and that happened twice, right? So if there are that's the gene that the mutation in the lactase enzyme, which breaks down milk sugars, lactose, and if you have this mutation, it stays on into adulthood. It's on for all of us when we're infants, right? Because we have to be able to nurse because we're all mammals. But if you have this mutation, it stays on. And actually, that mutation happened twice independently, once in East Africa, one in Northern Europe when people started farming. So, yeah, diet can have huge pressures on our genomes, and no surprise, right? Because again, everything's energetics in a way. It all comes down to how you take energy out of your environment and turn it into kids, right? That's all evolution cares about. And so
it's boiled down so simply.
Yeah. So if you do a better job at that, selection cares.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Hey, before we move on to talking about some of the ways you measured energy and sort of different flavors of energy expenditure, I want to circle back to the Hadza for a minute and just ask. So I think we maybe gave the impression that they spend all of their day, walking and working in various ways to get what they need. But in the book, you lay out sort of time budgets for how often they're actually doing these things, and it's not as much as you would think, right? They're working on what, like 4 or 5 hours a day to get what they need. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the day and depends on but yeah, it's sort of, if they actually spend as much time sitting on their butts as we do in the US too, right? So, but when they're moving, they're really active, and when they're not, they're not. And so, it's, they sleep the same amount as we sleep, right? They get as much time kind of just hanging out as we get hanging out. But
not glued to their cell phones, presumably.
Yeah, that's right. But sort of while we're standing around waiting for the bus or milling around our kitchens, imagine taking all of that time every day and just walking, boom, to the next tuber patch, and that's kind of how you end up getting all that physical activity. And I should say too, I'm not sure that we said this or if this is when we want to talk about it, but the big surprise was that even though they are so physically active, they don't burn more calories than you and me.
Yeah,
right?
that's
So
the big shock,
this
right?
really crazy adjustment, and we're still figuring out or trying to figure out how that's even possible. But but that was the big surprise.
Well, you've seen our notes somehow. I mean, this is exactly where we wanted to go, Herman. So thanks for the
good.
segue. Tell us. Let's try to get there though with a little bit more about how you got these data, because it comes from carrying around the respirometry system you mentioned, but especially this use of a technique that we talked about with another recent guest, Christine Cooper, who's used doubly labeled water to quantify daily energy expenditure and whatever types of organism you want to work at. But you started pursuing that because of sort of concerns about another measure of energy expenditure, basal metabolic rate, which has been foundational.
Yeah.
And so kind of walk us through the techniques that you used and maybe why you wanted to focus on daily energy expenditure, and then where that's led us in terms of, whoa, these guys don't really spend any more calories. And I think that'll launch us off to the rest.
If you go back to the earliest days of people measuring metabolic rates, and all that early science, nobody ever really wanted to measure basal metabolic rates. Nobody set out to do that. It just turned out that that's what you can measure in a lab.
Right. And the basal metabolic rate for the unindoctrinated is what?
Yes. It's the energy you use at total rest, not cold, not hot, not digesting, not stressed out. It's just completely, the basal means the lowest. It is
Right.
the lowest amount of energy that your body can spend totally at rest and chilled out.
Okay.
And that ends up to be a very repeatable measurement. If I measure, if I get you, so here's what I have to do. You have to make sure you haven't eaten in a while. You have to make sure you're not psychologically stressed out. You have to make sure you're in a room that's not too hot and too cold. And it has to be early in the morning because there's a circadian rhythm to these things.
Mm-hmm.
And if I do that, if I measure you, Marty, this tomorrow morning, and then I measure you next week, and I will find that that's a repeatable measurement for you.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason it's repeatable is it's basically, we've found this out over the last century of doing this kind of work, that it is your organs basically just doing the background work to keep you alive, right? So, and actually that it turns out that just baseline organ tissue work is, even for a really active person, is how you spend most of your calories. That's the biggest portion of it. So people measured basal metabolic rates because they could do it. They could get you in a lab and they could measure it in 20 minutes, and they could do it with an animal. And you have to be completely still, right? So you have to have the person constrained or the animal kind of in a box or something like that. Great. And you measure that with oxygen consumption and CO2 production by measuring the air in the room or in the hood or however the person's constrained.
Right.
Great. No, that's an interesting data point, but it's kind of a wonky data point, right? You don't lose or gain weight or have to set your diet around or anything like that around your basal metabolic rate, because on top of your basal metabolic rate is all the other stuff you do. And when you add all that together, that's your total energy expenditure over the course of 24 hours, right? That's everything.
Mm-hmm.
And almost all of what you care about as an ecologist or as a life history person or as a dietitian or a nutritionist is really that total energy expenditure number. But it turns out it's hard to measure because, again, we can only do the breath by breath stuff, or when you're in the room in the box.
Mm-hmm.
And so middle of last century, 1950s or so, post World War II, and all the tragedies of World War II, people were really interested in going beyond BMRs, basal metabolic rates, and understanding total energy expenditures so that they could figure out how much food to give to, people who were starving in the wake of World War II, or what energy people need. And so there's no way to measure it, right? Zero ways to measure it. So they did what you would do, I think, what I would have done, maybe if I'd have been smart enough. And you said, well, look, there's basal metabolic rate. We know that really well. And then we know that you have to spend energy on other stuff too. And that other stuff you're spending it on is a lot of it's activity, moving around, doing work. And so if I know your activity and I know your BMR, then I can guess how many calories you have to burn every day. Mm-hmm. And that tells me how much food you eat. And that has become the dogma, right? And so if you go to an online energy expenditure calculator right now or whatever, right, that's how many calories it says you burn. So like you guys are wearing your Fitbits, right? Art, how many calories does it say you burned today or whatever?
Let's see. 675 so far. Still pretty early.
And presumably that. And Marty, do you have a calorie tracker on yours?
I do, but it's not easily accessible. So
that's all right. And let me ask you, so it probably has your weight in there? Does it have
yeah, if I tell it to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's taking your weight and your age maybe, and it's estimating your basal metabolic rate, and then it's taking all those little movements, it's adding up, and it's figuring out how much it thinks you burned. Mm. That's a completely reasonable way to do things, and it turns out to not work.
Sorry, Fitbit.
Yeah, or it doesn't work well enough because it's people burn 3,000 calories a day, and if that estimate is off by 10%, which would be actually if it's that would mean that it's 90% accurate. That would be amazing. It's not, but if it was off by 10%, that's 300 calories a day. You can do a lot with 300 calories a day, right? Mm-hmm. You can have so for an ecologist perspective or a life history perspective, any kind of, that's not good enough, man. To just guess basically. And not only that, but then it also assumes that there's this really tight linkage between how physically active you are and how many calories you burn. And as we've discovered, actually, it's not that, doesn't work like that either.
So basically you're saying that you can do this sort of piecemeal, right? So you could measure the energy cost of different activities in some very careful way in the lab, and then just extrapolate to how often you do those and how intensely you do those activities in your wild, and then voila, You have the total energy expenditure. What you're saying is that you can't do that.
You can do it.
And many have.
It's not really what you want to
many
know.
do. It just doesn't actually work.
Yeah.
Okay.
And by work, I mean, it's almost a random number generator.
Okay. So why doesn't it work?
Well, because, and this is all the stuff we're discovering and we're talking about in the book, is that your body is doing all of this interesting metabolic shuffling, it seems, so that if you are more physically active, it's burning less energy on other stuff. And so there is, at the end of the day, the energy that you're burning, it is true. It is a truism. It has to be true that the energy you burn at the end of the day includes your activity and your BMR and all this other stuff. Everything you do, everything your body does, but your body's being very clever about shifting energy allocation to different tasks so that the total energy you burn at the end of the day is, it seems to be, kept in a pretty narrow range, pretty narrow window, and not just a reflection of how active you were.
Got it.
That is profoundly different, though. I mean, I think we need to pause on that a little bit, Art, because that is so completely different than, I think generally we're told. And I've been encouraging my wife to read your book, and I know that we're going to have a lot of conversations. I will have to convince her of your wisdom, because this is just not how, diets have been pitched to us.
Yeah, it's not how anybody thinks about it, right? The total received wisdom is you want to lose weight, you go out and be more active and burn more calories, right?
Yeah. But what's funny about that is if you try to pin down why you think that, the reason
it slips
you think
away
that is because, again, they didn't have a way to measure total energy expenditures. And so they guessed. And that guess became the received wisdom. I mean, I think there's a larger story here for all science in general, which is, be careful about the received wisdom, man, because, you guys must have examples of this in your own training or your own work, where like you realize, holy cow, the assumptions people have been making are just not based on anything.
Yeah, that's kind of our MO. We just sort of try to tear down foundations of things.
The BS spotter,
Yeah, exactly. So do you think that, I mean, I think you do think, because of a couple of places in your book, that this might also stem from conceiving the body as a machine, right? Because if you sort of engineer a system, it's more reasonable because you can't get this sort of reallocation unless you build that into the system. Whereas that's not how bodies evolve. I mean, trade-offs are to be expected. We've all, our genomes lived through eons of starvations.
That's right.
So we end up with systems that can kind of make these adjustments, and totally different system that you'd expect from, you made it if you built it.
And not to not to sort of tease doctors too much on your podcast. And I'm sure if you're a doctor listening to this, you can just turn down this volume for 5 minutes. But there is an assumption in medicine, right, that the body works in this kind of coherent way, and that we can understand it. And for the most part, that works pretty well. And that's how medicine works, is we find, you bring the car into the shop, you find out what that knocking sound is, and you fix the engine, and it goes back out. And a lot of medicine is like that, or seems to be, I don't know, as a consumer of medicine. And I think that, in the medical world, where I would also put like diet world and nutrition world, right? We tend to think of the body as this coherent, sensible system that we can tweak the parts and it works the way we expect it to.
Mm-hmm.
And we are continually surprised when it doesn't work that way. And it doesn't work that way for very good reasons if you were to think about things from an evolutionary point of view, which I think, this movement to doing sort of more evolutionary medicine or more evolutionarily informed medical training is so overdue and is so powerful and useful. But why would you ever expect that the body would be that simple? Why would you ever expect that the body would not fight you if you were trying to make it lose weight? Of course. I mean, half a billion years of multicellular life, of vertebrate evolution. And for those 500 million years, losing weight is a really bad signal. Losing weight meant that you're going to die. And you're going to die, and you're not going to have any reproductive success anymore. And so, you fight that. Your body has been fighting that since we were, worm-like critters. I don't know if it's Burgess Stale. I don't know if it's that old, but it's old, And so, of course, your body doesn't want to lose weight. and there's all these ways to manipulate it. Anyway, so I think that we're told, I think too many doctors are trained that it's a simple engine-like system. I think that that's the version of reality that we're sold in self-help books and and on the covers of glossy magazines that you check out of this grocery store, all those Shape and whatever. Not to pick on any of them. They all do this. They're all regurgitating the received wisdom that it's this easy, simple engine-like system, and it's not how it works.
Yeah.
And why did we ever think it was? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple threads to dig into here. And I think one obvious one is, well, if we know that activity itself incurs an energy cost, you have to spend energy to do it. So why doesn't your daily energy expenditure go up if you're more active? So I guess the implication is that something about the basal parts of what's going on in your body are going down to compensate. So maybe lay that out for us.
Yeah. So, what's even weirder is that as your body's adjusting to more physical activity, we don't always see that adjustment in basal metabolic rates, right? Because so to get into the weeds a little bit on that, so your basal metabolic rate we measure, at 7 a.m, fasted, whatever. But that's actually not. If you were just to lay down on the sofa behind you right now, assuming there's a sofa
Tempting.
behind you, we wouldn't measure a basal metabolic rate on you. We would measure something else because you're awake and you're alert, and it's not 8 a.m. anymore, and
lots of this.
And you had some coffee, and so you're, so we would call that resting energy expenditure, which is not the same thing. And resting energy expenditure kind of goes up and down in a circadian way, and only at the very bottom of the trough is that basal metabolic rate. Anything else, it's like anything else is sparkling metabolism. It's not champagne. So so only at the bottom of the trough there's a BMR. Everything else is resting energy expenditure. And so what I think is happening is that you're getting the rest of that circadian rhythm squashed, and you might not see it in BMR. But that's not what you're asking. What you're asking is, how does it adjust at all? And I don't think we really know entirely. We have a few good leads, and we're pushing that down. And I almost put off writing this book for another 5 years so that I could have a chapter on exactly all the ways that it's happening.
Book number 2.
Book number 2. Here's what we have. We have the observation that whether it's the Hadza or other active populations, or even among animals, if you look at like a zoo primate versus a primate in the wild, right? There aren't differences in total energy expenditure that track activity. So somehow the body's adjusting. I think even the skeptics, people who were very skeptical about the initial Hadza results 10 years ago, I think have come around to admitting that, that it is true that activity doesn't correspond directly to daily expenditure in the way that it ought to. Now the current debate, I think, is your question, which is, how does that happen? And there's a few possibilities. One is that you change the way that you change physical activity in subtle ways that we don't pick up on it with a Fitbit, right? So I don't think that that's what's happening. So people call that NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis.
Meaning like you fidget less.
Yes, exactly. So there could be some of that less. And for example, if you stand versus lay down, your accelerometer will measure zeros either way, but standing takes more energy than laying down. So you could do things like that. I've modeled that out, thinking about different activity costs and fidgeting costs. There doesn't seem to be enough fidgeting in the world to do the level of change that we're seeing, of compensation that we seem to be seeing. So maybe it contributes, but I don't think it's the whole story. You could sleep more or less, but we measured that, and at least with the Hadza, that's not what's going on. What's more interesting, I think, and I think there's something here, is that your body is physiologically adjusting, that resting metabolic rate. Well, what is that resting metabolic rate? It's what all your tissues and organs are doing, and you can adjust that. And we know that those things do change over time and depending on circumstance. And so we think that those adjustments are what's making room, basically, for more physical activity. And so to give you an example, if you are a physically trained person, you're a regular exerciser. If I scare you and I watch your heart rate go up and come back down, it'll go up, down, and come back down faster than if you are an untrained person. And the same with your cortisol response, right? So stress
sort of
reactivity
different
is
stress
less.
responses. Yeah.
Yeah, and they did a really nice. There's a nice study on this for a different reason. Those are always the best studies to steal from, because they didn't have your hypothesis in mind when they collected the data. So they don't care if you're right or wrong, right? So in some ways, that's perfect. There were a study of college women who had they reported mild depressive symptoms, and so they were enrolled in the study to see if exercise would help them with their depression. And it did, which is great. Another so you should definitely exercise. By the way, all of this is not to tell you to not
we
exercise.
want to get to that. Yeah.
So at the end, it did help them with their depression. But they also did a couple of fun things. It was a within subjects crossover design. So what that means is you measure the same person twice, once when they're not doing exercise for a few weeks, and once when they are doing exercise regularly for a few weeks. And in those non-exercise versus exercise periods, they took a 24-hour urine collection, and they measured all the catecholamines you produced and all the cortisol you produced. And they actually could show that when you're exercising, and it wasn't even it wasn't like intense, it was like pretty moderate, easygoing exercise, women produced 30% less adrenaline and 30% less cortisol over 24 hours than in the previous. And we know what those chemicals do to your body. They get your metabolic rate ramped up. So those kind of adjustments can make room. Inflammation is much lower if you exercise. And what's inflammation? Well, it's innate immune response that, you need some of it, but you don't need as much as people have often going on chronically in the background all the time. And so if you turn that down, people have been noticing for a long time that exercise reduces inflammation. But the next step would be, well, then it must also be your immune system must be spending fewer calories. It has to be. Isn't that what it means to be doing less, right? Reproductive hormone levels go down. So among the Hadza, men's testosterone levels are about half of what they are among men in the U.S. So, and we know
that's a
from
counterintuitive result,
studies,
right? I mean,
it is.
It's got to be these manly hunter-gatherers out there, doing their thing.
Yeah, and they are. I mean, they are tough. I mean, they're super generous, nice, funny, great people, but they are tough. Anyway, so that's where this is pointing, and we're trying to get that data now and do, because what it would take is, rather than, I've written review papers on this, and I've looked at and so I think the data all point this way. But what needs to happen is a longitudinal study where we take somebody who is sedentary-ish, and we get them ramped up to being much more physically active, and we want to watch all of the switches get turned down on all the other physiology that their bodies are doing. And so we have plans in the works, grant applications, and to do that, but I don't have the results for you yet.
So Herman, in animal studies, it was my understanding that sort of the composition of BMR and the kinds of things you're talking about, where some physiological functions and even whole organs and tissues get kind of taken apart, and I mean that happened. Like migrant birds are one of the major ones, right? They completely change their muscle physiology, and their digestive system atrophies when they're about to get on a long haul. So that is I mean, you're talking about sort of in humans, whether or not these kinds of things happen and whether there are other explanations, but in a broad sense, there's a cap on daily energy expenditure, and you're making allocations below that. That is a reasonable way of thinking about things from diverse forms of life.
And thanks for pointing that out. And that's totally right. And, I think that's one more reason that doctors should also learn, not just evolutionary biology, but they should also learn comparative biology.
Yeah.
Be more, broadly educated about how the body can respond. Because that's exactly right. I mean, we see seasonal responses, what's hibernation?
Yeah,
hibernation is a complete reworking of your metabolic rate because there's no food, and it's cold. I don't know how much those things contribute. But.
So let's turn now. I mean, this ought to have just profound implications for, human health in the first world and the obesity epidemic, and sort of what we need to do to combat that. So what are the implications of this constrained daily energy expenditure?
Yeah, so there are a couple big ones that I can think of and spell out in the book. One is that So obesity has to be fundamentally about taking in more food than you burn off, right? That's the physics of it. And so there's this argument, well, is it diet or is it exercise? Or there's this kind of mushy, messed up public health messaging that it's both, that we have to do both to balance both sides of the equation. And exercise is always given as a way to help lose weight and to keep weight off. If you look at the WHO or CDC guidelines, but what this work is saying is that the energy expenditure side of that equation is really hard to move, right? Your body's going to fight it. You might, we didn't talk about this yet, but that adjustment that we're talking about, it doesn't happen immediately, right? It's going to take a few weeks to kick in. And like day to day, you might still have fluctuations. We would expect that too. But as a long-term solution to obesity, exercise isn't going to do it, because over time your body adjusts to that new normal, and the expenditure side doesn't change. And so what would happen? Well, gosh, if that were the case, then if I started a new exercise program, I'd lose a couple pounds early, and then it would stop happening. It's like, well, gosh, guys, that's exactly what every exercise study's ever shown, right? So then you got to focus on the diet part. Why is it's the energy in part of that equation that's causing obesity. And then you got to ask, well, then why is that such a problem? Why isn't our body better at regulating energy intake? It's so good at energy expenditure regulation. And the answer there gets complicated, because your body is pretty good at regulating energy intake. Normally, you think you burn about 3,000 calories a day. There's about 3,500 calories in a pound of you, right? More or less. And so even if you gained a pound a year, right, that's just a little bit over a
slight imbalance.
Yeah. So that's one 365th, right? That's how much you're off by. You gain 2 pounds, it's 360. So your weight, even people who are slowly gaining a couple pounds a year, and that is the obesity crisis, by the way. It isn't like people gain 30 pounds in a year. They gain a couple pounds a year, and they go from being a healthy weight 20-year-old to being an overweight 40-year-old. It's the intake side that's the problem, but it's just such a small amount that has all of the markings of a regulation issue, right? It's a dysregulation thing. It isn't like, and so we need to stop haranguing people about diet choices too, for that matter, because people aren't going out there saying, gosh, I hope I could develop, obesity today. That's not, the people aren't trying to do that, right?
Yeah.
And instead you have to look at, like, well, why is it that in this food environment that we've built for ourselves, these human zoos that we all live in, that our brains are doing a bad job at regulating energy intake. This isn't my area of work. I'm not a nutritional, this isn't what I do, but there's lots of great work out there showing, Kevin Hall's done work on this, that processed foods that are literally engineered by, people to be overeaten, your brain has a really hard time handling the input from that, and your reward systems get overwhelmed, and you eat too much. And so that's I think the implication for this work is one, that you can't change the energy output part very much, so you got to focus on diet. And then when you drill down on that side of it, well,
that's hard in its own way. Yeah. Right.
So this is you use the word regulatory problem, which Art and I love to think about biology in terms of regulatory problems. Why, or are there, is it just my naivety? Are there concerted efforts now to, we haven't said hypothalamus, I think, but a lot of this sort of regulation.
Let's just say it now.
Let's say hypothalamus, this special part of
your
brain. Yeah, we're all, haha. What's going on there? I mean, are there drugs being used to either, other parts of the brain about reward systems, or in the hypothalamus for the regulation of thyroid hormones and things like leptin and, these other.
Right. People thought it was going to be leptin, right? I mean,
yeah, leptin was supposed to be magical when it was discovered not too long ago.
Yeah,
right.
And it turns out we are fantastic at treating obesity in mice, because it works for them. Leptin works for mice. And there's some evidence that it kind of helps in humans, but it wasn't the silver bullet that everybody thought it would be. But it's going to be something like that. But the hypothalamus, which sits right at the center of that reward and regulation system, it's getting lots and lots of signals, right? It's getting, when you eat a meal, it's not just getting the hormonal signal of leptin release that says, okay, we're filling up our fat cells now, so we're all good. But it also is able to sense the glucose and the proteins that are in your blood from the meal. It's able to sense via the brainstem signaling the stretch of the stomach as you fill up, right? So like, you're talking about, and also not only that, but it's also speaking to the reward systems of your brain that are talking to your taste buds and
right.
all of that. And so, yeah, look, if any of us knew what drug you would take to get your hypothalamus back in line, we wouldn't be having this conversation like this. We'd be in Tahiti or something, in our evil moon cave, rolling our billions of dollars. Because that's the multi-billion-dollar question. It's like, how do we get the system back on track? But I think one thing that is fun with this is that if it's the brain, then that makes a really simple prediction. Then all the variants, and there are at least 900 of them, all the genetic variants in the human genome that have been associated with obesity should be active in the brain. And sure enough, like almost all of them are, more active in the brain than anywhere else. So this is a regulation.
It's about those regulatory systems. Got it. Yeah.
Look, can I ask you about another, hold on, Art, can I ask you about another pharmacological opportunity, also sort of involving the regulation step? Because, I can't let this go.
Yeah.
We have danced around the idea that BMR is the sort of aggregate of all the activities of your organs and things. And that suggests, and you write about it a few places, that, tissues are made up of cells. Which cell types cost the most? And has anybody ever talked about managing those cell populations? Obviously with fat cells, duh. But managing of cell metabolism as a mechanism to control.
So the closest I've seen to that is there are drugs that mess with your mitochondria in ways that either basically improve, if that's the word for it, increase proton leak. And so, basically you're churning away, burning calories or making ATP, and you're not actually making the ATP, but you're going through all the respiration process to do that.
Make your whole body into brown adipose tissue.
Yeah, metformin, and this is like trying to do math in public. I refuse. But there is a complicated set of mechanisms by where metformin, which is a really common diabetes drug, messes with AMPK and energy signaling in the cell, and also has weight loss effects by actually messing with the mitochondrial energy production. But like, if you wanted to make the real problem is, like, you don't want to make cells a whole lot more active, right? I mean, that's called cancer, and that's a dangerous game. And you don't want to make systemically things more active. There's all sorts of stimulants out there that'll do the trick. But there are whole lots of reasons we don't do that either. So, Well,
no, it's super complicated, but in the mad scientist in me, every time you wrote about it in the book, that, populations that have on average greater likelihood of infection, that influences what their metabolisms look like. Absolutely. And so if you start to put all of these pieces together, if in the westernized populations we have other mechanisms for dealing with infections, those tissues sort of become superfluous. So are the ways to manage, working in immunology is I'm taking myself out of a job by advocating for this, but if we were to sort of take into consideration that we don't need our immune systems in the same ways, could that be a management opportunity? By chopping out that part of the equation.
Or do you go the other direction with it and say, let's give everybody hookworm?
Well, I wasn't going to offer that as a possibility, but sure.
Or let's give everybody so what do you think about that? So there's a part of the book that I ran through quickly because I don't know what to say about it, which is the whole microbiome question, right? And it is early days and exciting days in the microbiome, but we know about there's an enormous amount of signaling that goes on there. There are deep connections to the immune system, especially if you talk about parasites in the gut. What do you guys think? Are you believers? Are you buying or selling on the microbiome for in my estimation, it's kind of, the microbiome is the new human genome project. And we're going to be both amazed and disappointed by everything we discover.
As with everything in the history of biology, it's going to go that way. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
there's so many things that the microbiome does that there's a ton to learn there. It's no way it's going to be the silver bullet because nothing else has ever been.
Right.
But yeah, I think it is a really interesting area to think about.
Yeah, and one more prosaic thing here. I wondered as I was reading your book if we know what fraction of our daily energy expenditure is due to the microbiome, right? And that ought to vary among people and with diets and that kind of stuff. So is that known?
I mean, there's some basic data on like blood flow changes to the digestive tract after a meal. Part of that is supplying nutrients that will, well, not nutrients, but part of it is helping with the metabolism of the microbiome, right? As an organ within your GI tract.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it's probably not super cheap, but we don't know. And then there's this philosophical question, and I get to ask this every now and then, and I don't really have a great answer, which is, how do you count that in the accounting of an energy budget, right?
It feels like it totally should be counted, right? I mean, they're part of you, essentially.
Why not? Yeah.
Right. But they're also not.
I hear skepticism.
Yeah. Well, so I say yes. I say, oh, we just count it all, and and if they weren't doing that work, your liver would do that work.
Yeah.
And so maybe not as well, but that would be the deal.
Yeah. I mean, they're part of the stream that's benefiting from the calories and nutrients that are going in your mouth and coming out the other end. So
right,
effectively they're part of you.
Yeah, but then then people who work on like ruminants and stuff like that are less sure that it's as
Yeah.
I don't know.
So this conversation kind of segues into a question I've been wanting to ask here for a few minutes, and that is, so I know you're not a public policy guy, but let's say that Joe Biden calls you up this afternoon and says, hey, I'm putting together an obesity committee to combat obesity in the U.S. We need basic research scientists on there to lead this effort. I want you. What would you recommend, and what would you do?
Well, policy-wise or research priorities?
Policy-wise, yeah. I mean, if you're willing to go there.
So yeah, I think we need to get ultra-processed foods off the table for kids. I think that us three talking here, the bus has left the station, and whatever metabolic cards we've been dealt, we're going to be managing with minor course corrections until we run out.
Depressing.
It's really hard to change. It is really, really hard to change because your body is this evolved system that doesn't like to change, likes to be dynamically stable. It's really hard to change adult physiologies. So I think you put all the chips on childhood obesity, which is this growing epidemic. And I think you solve that by, gym class is great. You need that too, but you fix the fact that something like 30% of the calories that we all eat are added sugars and added oils. And those problems are worse in people, in populations, that are poorer, because guess what? Processed food is cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would put all the chips on childhood obesity, and I would aggressively change the way that we price and supply diets for kids. And I would expect all the libertarian people to freak out, even though by every measure it would make everybody healthier and everything cheaper long term for healthcare.
Awesome, great.
Well, I don't want to leave this topic without singing the praises of exercise, because
that's right.
A couple of times you've touched on it, and maybe exercise isn't the solution for weight management, but tell us a little bit about all the good reasons that we need to continue to exercise.
You still have to exercise. So first of all, exercise is good for your brain. There's cognitive benefits. There's immune system benefits, which you guys could probably talk about more than I could talk about. There are muscle strength benefits. There's cardiovascular. So there's all these things that we know are really good for you from exercise, which have nothing to do with how many calories you burn. And then there's the energetic piece of it, and I think this is the exciting part that I'm excited about, which is that all of those changes your body's making to respond to exercise to kind of keep your metabolic energy budget more or less the same, all of those adjustments are good for you, actually. Reducing stress reactivity is good for you. Reducing immune inflammation response is good for you. Reducing high levels of reproductive hormones are actually probably good for you. So we know that exercise is really good, protective against reproductive cancers, for example. So, all of that metabolic management that happens in response to exercise is probably a big reason why it's so darn good for you. So you got to do it. You absolutely have to do it. And there's also, and the people who would have been pushing exercise as a solution to obesity for a long time would also make the point, because they've kind of, I think the battle has gone the other way for them, but they would make the point, which is true, that exercise also seems to be good for keeping weight off.
Right. Right.
So there is
So if
a
you can
weight
manage to
component
eat less
there.
and lose pounds, then if you exercise, you're much more likely to keep that weight off.
And that's important, right? Because that's, because keeping weight, anybody can make short-term changes. Not anybody. I don't want to make it sound like it's easy, but people have more luck making short-term changes than the long-term changes. And so, that is a not small benefit, is that exercise helps you keep weight off. What I think personally, has to do again with this regulation thing that it does, but regardless of why, and I don't think we know yet, it's good for weight maintenance.
Awesome. Well, that's great. One other topic we wanted to hit here before we wrap up is you had this really interesting section at the end on elite athletes and sort of extreme endurance events. And that was kind of a revelation to me, because you spent a nice chunk of time talking about what limits human performance. So what keeps these elite athletes from doing their race even a little bit faster, or what allows people to keep going day after day for weeks or months if they row across the Atlantic Ocean. So what is what you've discovered inform about those limits?
Yeah, so we got into this. I got into this topic with my own research when this guy named Bryce Carlson, he's left academia. So he made it out alive. It's like a shotgun.
One of the few.
But he made it anyway. When he was still a professor at Indiana, he organized a scientific effort for this race across the USA, which was this insane foot race. It wasn't really a race. They weren't really racing each other. It was a communal fun thing. But the race across the USA, and they ran a marathon a day. They being, it was a dozen or so folks who did this, and we measured, I think, 6 of them in the study. Ran from the Pacific Ocean, to Washington D.C. over 5 months. So it was a marathon a day, 6 days a week.
That's just so unthinkable.
That's
I know, it's incredible. And so we measured energy expenditures at the beginning, and then we measured energy expenditures at the end. And I was interested in watching the body adjust, right, to see if it changed the way it burned calories and everything else. Could your body adjust to make room for a marathon a day? The answer is no. That's too much. Fine, but so it adjusted, but not that whole amount, which is interesting in itself. What the limits of adjustment can be. But then I thought, well, gosh, I wonder how this stacks up against all the other, crazy extreme events that have ever been measured. And people have measured using this doubly labeled water technique. They've measured the Tour de France, and they've measured the Kona Ironman, and they've measured the Western States 100, and they've measured it. So, and I went out and found all the stuff I could find on this, all the measurements I could find. And if you plot the amount of energy expenditure they're able to maintain for these, the average daily energy expenditure of the Tour de France, for example, against how long the Tour de France lasts, and you do that for all the events, you end up drawing this very clean ceiling. You guys can appreciate this when you get data back and you plot it out and you go, oh, that's real.
That's not just a correlation.
Yeah, that's a real thing, So that was such a fun surprise. And basically what you're mapping out is the limits of endurance, right? Because, like you say, for the Tour de France, for example, if a person could have done more for those 28 days, if they could have revved their metabolic engine at a higher rate for 28, well, they would have won. They would win the Tour de France by hours and days, right? But nobody does that. Everybody's kind of so so that you've found a ceiling. And a couple funny things about that. At the very edge, the longest duration, highest energy expenditure thing that we could find is pregnancy. Right? 9 months at a metabolic scope, which is your total energy expenditure divided by your BMR, of 2.5 or something like that. So, about 4,000 calories a day for 9 months. Okay, so isn't that amazing, right? And so if you think, well, if the energy intake part, if the tissues, if the muscles pulling the energy in were the limiting factor here, then what's pregnancy doing as part of this group? Because it's a different set of tissues. It should be a different limit. And so instead, the fact that all these different events are all playing by the same rules suggests that it's the energy supply side, right? It's the part of the energy flow that gets it into your mouth and into your guts and through your liver and into your blood. And then we thought, well, if that's true, if that's the limit, then how does that all play out? And it turns out that if you're above, for activities that were above 2.5 times basal metabolic rate, everybody's losing weight slowly. So you can do it for a month or you can do it for a week, but you can't do it forever because you can't lose weight forever. You die. Mm-hmm. And so at about 2.5 basal metabolic rate, which is about 4,500 calories for most folks, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories a day would be most people's 2.5 BMR. For those folks, anybody above that's losing weight, anything below that, you can maintain weight. And pregnancy, of course, is parked right beneath that ceiling.
Just right there. Because
it has to be, right? And so then you're like, oh, wait a second. And this is still, that paper's a couple of years old now, and the event is 3 or 4 years old. And so this is just how slow things happen, at least for me in my science, but I'm still thinking about this, right? I don't think we know entirely what that means, but it suggests to me, there has been no selection, as far as I can tell, on the ability to ride a bicycle for a month, right? But there has definitely been selection on pregnancy. Mm-hmm. I can promise you that. And so that suggests to me that the entire system, the entire ceiling, has been pushed around by selection for reproduction, which I think is a kind of a fun piece to tie in.
So you're basically saying that the energetics of reproduction and gestation ultimately set the ceilings on all of these extreme athletic events that we're viewing around the world.
That's the provocative implication of this, and and we'll see. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, so let's dig into this just for a sec. So, it's about energy intake. So, is it about the capacity of our guts to digest the food and absorb this, like an upper limit to that, or is it about how much we can stuff in our mouths, or what?
No, I think it's. So somebody pointed this out the other day. Alex Hutchinson, actually, who writes for Outside Magazine, pointed this out to me. He's like, well, these world record hot dog eaters, they can eat a million calories a day. And so I looked into this because I'm like, oh, geez, he's right. And if they're actually absorbing all that food, then that's, wow, then I'm wrong, which is great. It's great. It's nice to be wrong. And no, you're wrong. And it turns out that when you look into this, I don't think anybody studied this. So one of your listeners should go and do this. Do this study, please. Figure out how much energy you actually absorb from these hot dog eating content. And I did a narrative review. No, not really, but I read as many accounts as I could easily Google. I didn't spend too much time on this, but it turns out that apparently the hours and days after one of these competitions are not pretty.
I'm sure.
People who do these hot dog eating things.
Yeah.
And you need like a different septic system in your home to make it work. Anyway, so the point is, I don't think it's the digestive tract. I don't think it's the sort of mechanical, how much food can you put down your gullet. Right. I think it's the absorption and
got it.
All that part.
So you have this interesting part of the book where you talk about this in relation to Michael Phelps, right? Who is widely reported to have eaten 12,000 kilocalories a day when he was, training for the Olympics. Yeah. And you basically do the math and say, no way. Yeah. That he can't possibly absorb that much, right?
No, that's right. Yeah. I mean, and even it turns out that was just propaganda, that was alternative facts. Is that what they're called?
Yeah.
Heard of those.
He's trying to scare the competition. I'm eating more energy than they are.
Or maybe he just has that special septic system like the hot dog eaters.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, but then it also raises the possibility that who are the Michael Phelpses? Is it the guy or woman who is the most dedicated to spending time in the pool? is that the person who gets to be the Olympic athlete? Because everybody wants, a lot of kids want to be Michael Phelps.
Uh-huh.
Is it that kid, or is it the kid whose, liver enzymes are a little bit more aggressive?
Got the biggest gut and the longest colon, right? I mean,
yeah. I don't know. It's interesting to think about that.
Yeah.
Again, more work for somebody to go and do. I'd love to see it. But it's two things about that I'll say to kind of wrap to connect it back to the Hadza work, because in my mind, of course, it's all connected. First of all, if you were to run that ceiling out and ask, what does that ceiling of metabolic limit predict for infinite amounts of time, which is sort of like for daily life over years and years and years, you end up having the same implied limit for daily life as we find the Hadza are living under, right? So it's sort of like you discover that limit again through this extreme events study, which is kind of fun. But the other piece of it is that that extreme events limit, metabolic limit, is born from the data, right? I can tell you, I never woke up one day and thought, I'm going to go discover the limits to the, to this, or I'm going to draw the line and I'm going to find the data to fill it in. I went and found the data, and that's what they look like, and it's the Hadza stuff too. I didn't expect, when I was writing the grants to NSF to get funding for the Hadza work initially, we wanted to find out how many more calories they spend every day than everybody else, because we knew it would be super high, and it turns out that's not what the data said. And so, I think like going out, listening to the data, being humble about that, being curious about that, and these are all, the data has led me to these fun places, and I'll be the first one to be excited when we go somewhere else, because the data points somewhere else. So, I hope that this sparks some kind of work by other labs, other folks, and I'm sure that this isn't the last word on this stuff. I'm sure that we're going to figure out.
Yeah, that's a great attitude.
So Herman, we want to give you the last word, and you can dwell on it in the background while you answer my last question. But the last one is sort of just give you the chance to say anything you want about the book or the future of your research that we haven't gotten to. But before you answer that one, is this ceiling thing specific to humans? And if our ceiling is representative of other ceilings and other primates or other species generally, I mean, how far away are we from maybe an ideal, if it's even possible to conceive an ideal?
Gosh, I don't know. There's
and you can say, forget it. We're going to move on. That's fine.
No, I think that our ceiling is a product of our evolution, like everything else in our physiology. I bet you the chimpanzee ceiling is different, although I can tell you that nobody's measured it and nobody ever probably will. That would be, you'd need, I don't know what the chimpanzee equivalent of the Tour de France
chimpanzees,
is, I'll let you organize that. I don't want to organize the chimp Tour de France.
Pass.
Hard. So, but I think just like you're talking about with the bird migration, right? Like, why can't we do that work? Why can't we tie that work in to the human nutrition work? And people are true, people do that. And it's always really cool, the connections people draw, but it's going to take that kind of perspective, right? It's going to take that kind of trying to find the interesting connections, which is what scientists do, right? This is what you guys do. It's what we all do. That's what's fun about this creative work, But so if I knew the answer right now, we'd go off and scurry off and try to do it. But it's going to take somebody to have the spark and get that creative idea.
Fair enough. So what else did we not give you the chance to say? What else would you like to leave the listeners with?
Well, yeah, we covered a lot, and this is really fun.
Did cover a lot.
It's fun to talk to biologists.
Great chat, yeah.
And so thanks for having me on. The one thing I would say is it was just a lot of fun to write this book. And it's been really fun to have these conversations, on either podcasts or lectures I've given over the years on this work. And I never really thought that I'd be lucky enough that the work I was going to do would spark people's interests and would be, the kind of thing that people would want to hear about in a book. And so I just feel really lucky to have had the chance to do all this. And I try to bring some of that fun into the book. So I hope when people read it, first of all, I hope people read it. And second of all, I hope they have as much fun reading it as I had writing it, because the work's fun, the writing it's been fun. And so I just feel really lucky. And again, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you guys about it.
Well, I think based on our experience, they will. Can you say something to us in Hadza?
You could say, My Hadza is limited, by the way,
Huh.
but fa atebe, which is like drink water.
Ah,
Or have another
And then
spoonful of honey.
there's also, I was learning this one very simple phrase, which tells you about the way that their grammar is constructed. And I'll butcher it. If you're listening, Brian, I'm sorry, or anybody who speaks Hadza fluently. But it's iklikwanakwote, which means I am going walking with him, and iklikwanakwoteiko, which would be I am going walking with her. But it's all one word, right? And it's in the agglutinative language where you stick everything together.
ooh, yeah.
Yeah. But there's fun things you always hear in a Hadza camp. You hear Bucho Hamana, which means like come here. And you hear the word za, which I talk about in the book. It's such a sharing, generous culture. You hear people saying za. Za means to give, and so I hope that's a piece of that the people will take away too. There's so many stories we tell ourselves about what the past was like, and there's so many stories out there, especially in the paleo world. I don't know why they get to do this, but they have just completely co-opted what hunter-gathering was like, what the past was like. And I think anthropologists have lots of actual direct work. This is a lot of work what we do. We go out and work with these communities, and I wish more anthropologists would write about that, because I think people would understand different cultures more deeply or better, or in a more human way. That's not just in the scientific literature, but it's just sort of what I try to do in the book is be conversational and talk about what daily life is like, because it's so much fun, and they're such wonderful, cool people. And I think that perspective, I think it's an important perspective to share. So, but yeah, it's just a really fun group of folks to work with. And anyway, awesome. I don't know where I was going with that, but I'll leave it there.
Fantastic.
No, it's great. I mean, and the book, I just have to say again, it's one of the most fun reads I've had in a while in general. And the fact that I learned a bunch of biology in it when I'm supposed to know that for my job. It is a rare thing to be so entertained while learning such heavy duty science. This is what Art and I try with this show, but man, we have to learn from you. you have mastered that which we aspire to. So it's really fantastic.
That's really nice of you to say. It's been, like I said, it really was fun, and I really do enjoy it. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Herman. Yeah, really great.